All right, good morning. Couple housekeeping notes. Your Chapter 3 reaction quiz is already posted, but since this is a shortened week, I have extended it out to Tuesday till it's due. So next Tuesday, you have till next Tuesday to get done. It's a little bit longer. It's a reading part. If there's an attached document, you'll read and a reaction quiz to that. Reaction quizzes were much better for this week. Make sure you're answering fully, not just a sentence answer. And I've got some feedback from most of you on that. That also being said, the Chapter 3 quiz will be scheduled for Friday. We'll be able to crank through these next couple of days of notes. We'll be at a brisker pace, but we'll get those done. We've been doing pretty good on that. The other thing is this chapter, or test number 1, which is units 1 through 4, or chapters 1 through 4, is posted. If you have questions on the study guide, we haven't got through all the material, but the first test is scheduled for September 21st. All people will be taking that with a proctor. Here at Rockville will be with me and at your respective places with proctor. It is not open note, open book, unlike the quizzes. And so if you have questions, ask me on that. Just let you know, that way the study guide is out there ahead of time. All the multiple choice will be from your previous quizzes, a collection of chapters 1 through 4. So it's not going to be all of them. It will be a few of them. All right, we're on to Unit 3, Creating Anglo-America. Focus questions. How did the English Empire in America expand in the mid-17th century? So we're going to see how the English expanded. How did slavery start and expand in the colonies? We're going to really dive into the slavery question a little bit more. What major social and political crises rocked the colonies in the late 17th century? And how did patterns of class and gender roles change in 18th century America? So these are some focus questions that we'll talk about as we go forth today. Introduction. Series of crises rocked the European colonies in the late 17th century. In 1675, Indian alliances attacks, about 4,000 total perish and push settlers eastward. So the Indians are going to counterattack and kind of push settlers more east. They've been expanding west, but Indians are going to double their efforts trying to keep the British expanding. A guy known as Metacom, or known as King Philip, was the main leader kind of organizing this. Think of it as kind of like a rally cry, and as a way to break the colonists' grip on the area. However, that's not going to deter the colonists. A ferocious counterattack broke the Indians' power in the region. The colonists were were better equipped, not outnumbering the Indians, but better organized, better equipped. Iroquois League is also going to ally with the colonists, so they're going to help the colonists. Atrocities were committed by Metacom. He was executed. Bloodthirsty savages entrenched the mindsets of the colonists from this point on. They're going to be savages. They're bloodthirsty. They're backwards. They are not good people. And then King Philip War broadening freedom of white New Englanders by expanding land access at the cost of freedom. So after King Philip's War, which we're going to talk about a little more later, access to land is going to become more readily available at the cost of Indians. So what the point of this introduction is setting the stage that, hey, the relationship with the Indians is going to get worse and worse as the colonists move westward. Okay, if we have time, we'll come back and watch this little video. The PowerPoint is posted online, but we'll come back and talk about this maybe later as time allows. Global competition, the expansion of England's empire. The mercantilist system. All right. Mercantilism is government should regulate economic activity so as to promote national power. Think of the world as a giant pie with a fixed amount of slices. So according to mercantilism, there's only so much money in this world, or wealth. We'll say it's $50 million. There is no more, no less. It is fixed at $50 million. So just like a piece of pie, think of the favorite piece of pie you want, or cheesecake, or whatever. What do you want? Do you want most of it, or do you want just a little of it? You want most of it, right? You want as much pie as possible. So, with this mindset, governments around the world, including the British, the French, and the Spanish, among others, are going to focus on, hey, we want to control as much trade, as much wealth in the world as we can. That will extend our power. Above all, trade should be controlled so that more gold and silver flowed into countries than left them. So the Spanish, the British, the French, etc., are going to control trade, so more money's coming in, all that wealth is coming into their countries. Colonies exist. I'm battling a cold, so many of you are. I apologize if my voice kind of goes adolescent here. All that trade needs to come back to the home countries. Colonies are there to facilitate the growth of the bigger countries. In this view, the role of the colonies was that they served the interests of the mother country, not the other way around. Commerce, not territorial plunder, was the foundation of empire. So money, trading. So think of it like in the terms of Amazon. How powerful is Amazon around the world? Pretty powerful, right? And it's all through e-commerce, right? They control a lot of portions of the world because they control the internet market, a lot of it. Navigation Act of 1651 aimed to wrest control of world trade from the Dutch. The Dutch were the FedEx of the day, and the English were like, we don't want to go through the middleman. We want to control it all. The most valuable colonial products had to be transported in English ships and sold initially in English ports. They're going to re-export to the foreign markets. So what this basically is going to say is, you own a trading ship or you're trading sugar in the West Indies. Before that sugar can go to the colonies in North America, it must go first to England, be redistributed, repackaged, whatever, and then sent to the colonies. If you have North American colonies, if you have a timber company selling wood, you send that wood from Virginia to England or London to get built into a desk. Then that desk is taken back to North America or to the West Indies or other parts of the empire to be sold. So everything must go through the mainland country first, in this case, England. Very controlled of trade. Foreign exports had to first go through England. So now let's say the Spanish are selling, we'll say coffee or tea or whatever. They must go first to London, then to the colonies respectively. So there's two colonies right next to each other. They had to go back and then forth. It's a little bit counterproductive if you think about it, but that's how the British controlled. This helped increase profits in England through customs duties and also the colonies. New England shipbuilding industry grew as a result of this. The other thing to think about this, as this is going on, is there going to be smuggling? Yeah. Do the English stop all the smuggling? No. As long as the English make a lot of money off this, if there's side money being made, okay. And they're not going to crack down on that smuggling initially. Okay? That's going to lay an important foundation going later on. You guys have had me before talking about the early years of the colonies. We talked about solitary neglect. The colonies benefited from being left alone. The British are not going to be forceful on a lot of things early on. Is that going to help them or hurt them later on? It's going to hurt them, right? When they try to crack the whip down later on. Okay, global competition, the expansion of England's empire too. The conquest of New England, or New Netherland. New Netherland will become what is known as New York. Charles II Restoration in 1660 helped spark new expansion. Remember, 1649, what happened to Charles I's head? Cut off, right? 10 years of Oliver Cromwell rule. In 1660, we have a new king come in, Charles II, the son. Now, if I was him, I would have probably been very leery about losing my head as well. It's a little bit, father died. Now, I'm not my father, but don't want to have the same fate as my father. Royal African Company, it will be created. It is given a monopoly of slave trade. Their whole purpose is bringing slaves from Africa to the American or the North American colonies in the Caribbean. We'll also call the West Indies colonies. In 1664, the English won control of New Netherland and several African ports in a war with the Dutch. What is most important is they're going to transform into an imperial outpost. They're also going to gain the colony of New York, which is very, very important, obviously, today in American history. The English expanded the freedom of some, but reduced others. Now, what's going to happen as this time period? Women are going to lose some valuable rights. Most importantly, they control their own business in their name. So if they have a husband or a male person over them, they're going to have to put it in their name. Women are not going to have the authority to always control that. They will expel free blacks from skilled jobs and will restrict them. There was some free blacks living in the colonies. That being said, now as they bring more Africans in, they want to make sure they establish that pecking order very specifically. They're not going to necessarily enslave those free blacks. They're basically going to say leave. Land was given to a few select families as they come in. So as this new acquisition of land is acquired in this war of the Dutch, it's going to be given select families. One of the most important families that will get land in the New York area is the York family. The Duke of York, who was given basically control of the area. That's where we get that New York term. Covenant chain, Alliance of Iroquois Federation will come in, will be led by Sir Edmund Andros, governor of New York, help clear lots of land. The Iroquois are going to basically concede some land, also take out some rival tribes. And this will help lay the foundation for expansion in that area. Iroquois were pushed further west by the Great Lakes tribes and the French. So they're going to be more in the western part as that colonial expansion is coming. Global competition and expansion will influence Empire 3. The Charter of Liberties. Many New Yorkers began to complain they were being denied the liberties of Englishmen. Some of them say we are not getting the same rights. This right to consent to taxation was a big thing. In 1683, the Duke of York agreed to call for an elected assembly to try to meet them in the middle. Drafted a Charter of Liberties and Privileges, trial by jury, security of property, religious toleration for all Protestants. So you start to see some of the same complaints that will plague the American Revolution, liberties of Englishmen, which is usually the ability to have an elected assembly, choose your representatives, shall we be taxed on what, etc. He concedes, he gives them this, and thus some reform comes to New York. Now, the founding of Carolina. As the British acquire another colony, New Netherland, and rename it New York, they already have the Virginia, they already have the New England colonies. Now they're going to look at what becomes the area that we call Carolina, north and south. Not until 1670 did the first settlers arrive to found Carolina. They're originally offshoot of Barbados. Barbados was a port city in the West Indies. Yes, all the way down to the Caribbean. What's that? Oh, okay. Now that being said, it's going to be an offshoot. Thus, a lot of the people that had colonies or assets like farming, slaves and stuff are going to move up from Barbados to North Carolina. Armed friendly Indians enslaved others. Between 1670 and 1720, more Indian slaves were exported from Charleston than the number of African slaves imported. So they are actually going to enslave a lot of the local population of the Carolinas and export them. There is more exported than imported at this time. We often forget the atrocities that happened to the Indians there. Now, this is not a common enslavement of Indians. That does not become a common theme. It's more of an isolated incident that only happens in the Carolinas. Yamani's uprising was crushed and most Indians were driven out, which was just basically an uprising to get some of this enslavement. They'll be driven out. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina in 1669 proposed to establish a feudal society with a hereditary nobility, serfs, and slaves. This is trying to go back to the medieval practice of putting slaves on land. And if you go through American history, the two colonies that really caused the most difficulty leading up with the slave question, well, actually the most common is South Carolina. What was the first state to secede from the Union in 1861? South Carolina. Which state threatened to leave the Union in 1829 to 1831? South Carolina. Because they wanted a very rigid system based on feudal. Meaning, slaves are at the bottom, they work the land, they can't leave, they are permanent there. Then you have a big, poor white class that are below the privileged few, right? The plantation owners. This idea carries over all the way even to this day in some cases. From the get-go, Carolinas have this as their mindset. In order to attract settlers, though, they provided an elected assembly and a quote-unquote religious toleration, and a generous head right system of 150 acres of land to get people to move there. That being said, though, this feudal idea is going to stick around. That Southern gentleman mentality will be very much in the Carolinas. And what that means, that Southern gentlemen, they're going to call themselves Cavaliers from from that 1640 Civil War, is going to be their title for nobility. They're trying to mimic the English. The reality, what they're recreating, is a very strict system in which only a few hold power. Rigorous legal code that promised slave owners absolute power and authority. Those who brought slaves instantly acquired large new land holdings. Introduction of rice made an epic center of mainland slavery. The Carolinas are going to be where the primary slaves comes to the New World initially. They will expand to Virginia later on, but the Carolinas is where the initial African slave population comes into the colonies. And then it will be eventually expanded into North and South Carolina. But the idea here is rice is introduced. Rice grows in wet climates very well. The Carolinas is a wet climate. thus the need for slave labor. Make sense? Now, like I'm telling you here, this absolute power and authority, if you look even to the Civil War and then the rise of the KKK, this authority complex, absolute power of slave owners, carries all the way up for several hundred years. And in some cases, if you go there in pockets that refuse to accept changes, that mentality still exists. So from the get-go, that is embedded in a lot of the Carolina colonies. I'm not saying the whole Carolina colonies is bad. What I'm just saying is that is something that is embedded from the get-go. Okay, global competition, the expansion of England's empire, number 5. The Holy Experiment. The last English colony to be established in the 17th century was Pennsylvania. It was founded in 1681 by a guy named, or proprietor, William Penn. Hence the name Pennsylvania. He envisioned a place of religious harmony. Indians and whites could coexist. He was also a Quaker. Quakers are the people who create Quaker oats. You ever eat your oats? They have that little guy in the front. I think that is William Penn, actually. But the point of it is, he's a Quaker. What is a Quaker? It's a very traditionalist as far as religious concerns, but there's a big difference between the Pilgrims, the Puritans, and the Quakers. For one, they are more tolerant. You don't have to be their quote-unquote version of Christianity. Additionally, they're pacifists. They don't believe in war. They think war should not occur or happen. So once in a while, you hear this more often in World War II, a Quaker refused to go to war. And that was a religious exemption that did exist. Meaning, they're drafted, they can be exempted for not wanting to fight. That being said, this becomes problematic when you get to like Vietnam War, when everyone wants to be a Quaker at that point. But he was a Quaker. He believed in a place that Indians, whites, all could coexist and live happily. Penn considered his colony a holy experiment like the Puritans before him with the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, but on one of much better principle. He hoped he would be governed according to Quaker principles. Thus, all persons were equal. Liberty was a universal entitlement, not the possession of any single people. He was pacifist. Christian liberty to all affirm the belief in God and not use their freedom to promote licentiousness. Jews were barred from office, though they are tolerant. Jews are universally still not liked. Strict code of personal morality. You did not have affairs. You did not commit adultery. You did not steal. You did not lie. You did not cheat. The other unique thing about the Quakers, I just had it and I forgot it. Oh, this portion, all people are equal. They also did not believe in slavery. In fact, fast forward 100 years, when the Constitutional Convention occurs and the writing of the Constitution, there is a group from Pennsylvania that is trying to get slavery barred with the new Constitution. They were this close to getting it barred. There was people from some of the New England states that were willing to listen, but the reality was to get the Constitution ratified and passed, they had to have the Carolinas, Virginia, and all those southern states agree upon it. Banning slavery, forget the Carolinas. They wouldn't have existed at all. But understand, vastly different than any other colony up to this point, considering religion. Land in Pennsylvania. So this is global competition, expansion of England's empire, number 6. Penn established and appointed a council to originate legislation and elected assembly. Once again, this idea of self-government, though it's a proprietary colony that's not a royal colony yet, it will become later a royal colony, he did allow, on his own right, an elected assembly. Indentured servants who owned land of 150 acres were allowed as well to be part of this. So former indentured servants that became free could be part of this elected assembly. That's a revolutionary idea. Just because you were poor didn't mean you couldn't make your way up and become part of the elected assembly or part of the governing body. This is a drastic change from other parts of the colonies where they would not allow a lot of other rights. Excuse me. So this is something new. You can move. Social mobility is real in the Pennsylvania society. Now, how it would be hard for an indentured servant to necessarily get 50 acres of land, but if they were able to achieve it, they definitely gained some more rights. The colony prospered, which this makes sense. This is there's a lot of opportunity. Ironically, his success helped lead to the deterioration of freedom of others. Now, as this will expand, there will be some deterioration of freedoms across other colonies and even in Pennsylvania later on. Mostly it's going to come at the expense of the Indians in Pennsylvania. Okay? So you have a drastically different changing colony here. Last in the 17th century, and it's uniquely different. Like I said, he tries to advocate a much broader actual toleration. The sad reality is, if they had agreed, the rest of the colonies had agreed to this, we might have been able to avert some of our future problems in the United States. However, that key part right there, dealing with slavery, is not going to be universally agreed upon. Okay, now moving on to the question of slavery, American slavery, or origins of American slavery. The incessant demand for workers fired Chesapeake planters to turn to slave labor. Not necessarily, that shouldn't be fired. That should be forced. Gotta love typos. Slaves offered many advantages over indentured servants. So as the Carolinian and eventually even Virginians needed workers, they're going to turn from indentured servants to slaves. We all understand business practices, right? If you can cut excess fat or excess fish, what are you going to do? Go to a cheaper alternative, right? I know some of you have worked at the food industry briefly. One of the biggest costs is product, right? Is getting food and everything. If you can cut something in half and double your profits, you're going to do that. That's the biggest problem with like raising minimum wage in some of the restaurant business, and this is what happened in Seattle. No one's going to disagree that we shouldn't pay people more. The problem is, where's that balance in the food industry? If you knew that food industry has a very small margin, in order to pay more people, what do you have to do? Raise costs. Now, this is done from a racist point of view, not a modern business practice. They're looking to make more money at the cost of people's freedom and lives. Englishmen and Africans, English had long viewed alien peoples with disdain. Once again, going back to the difference between the Spanish and the French, the English don't like to mingle with other people. The French had tolerated the Indians. They even intermarried them. We've talked about that. The Spanish thought the Indians backwards, but did they allow their people to eventually marry? Yes. The English, on the other hand, do not want anybody to intermingle with others. That being said, it's included to Indians and blacks. They're also going to view blacks as so alien that they're enslavable, meaning they're not really free people. Thus, they're not even real people. They can be enslaved. Now, slavery in history. Slavery has existed for most the entirety of human history. Slavery in the Americas was based on the plantation system that we've talked about a little bit. So basically, you have one rich person, has a lot of land, a lot of slaves. They can afford them. An agricultural enterprise that brought together a large number of workers under the control of a single owner. So initially, that would have been indentured servants. Indentured servants, though their contracts expire, it's expensive to bring them over, and plus they tend not to like to follow rules. So what are they going to do? They're going to bring something in that's an alternative that's cheaper and more controllable. Slaves. Horrible, horrible, horrible. But is slavery anything new to the world at this point? No, it's just now Americanized for the colonies. Slavery has existed for thousands of years. We often forget about the enslavement of Egyptians, the building of the pyramids. Yes, they built them, not aliens. We're not going to get into that debate. The Colosseum, lots of the Roman projects were built with slaves. Not always, but a lot of them. Greek, and so forth. Asian, the Chinese empires of old. Slaves have been used for various products. Now, slavery would be associated with race. Now, this is where it's going to be more distinctly different. Those slaves could be any race of people. It didn't necessarily matter the color of your skin. America, it is going to matter. And that's going to be a race concept that drew a permanent line between whites and black. They're now going to view whites are free, blacks are slaves. You are not white, and you're not a slave. Okay? So if you're white, you're not a slave. They're going to equate that as a way to keep those race of people in bondage. And it's going to be something from the get-go that will become more and more stressed. Not mean everyone believed that, but from the initial way to justify it, they're going to view them as subhuman. And they're going to keep it that way for centuries. Now, slavery in the West Indies. Now, slavery in the West Indies is where it's really going to first become a huge, huge market. Yes, the Carolinas and eventually the Chesapeake, Virginia areas will bring in slaves, but where slavery gets its first stronghold, in, at least from African slave perspective, will be the West Indies. It was viewed as too costly initially, but once they streamline, they create that Royal African Company, they get better systems, they get traders in the African countries established, it'll become cheaper. Now, what's going to drive the initial demand? It's not rice, it's not tobacco, though those will bring them to the North America. It's sugar, sugar, sugar. How many here drink your coffee just black? I drink it black most of the time, but how many here, if you get coffee, want cream and sugar? Most of you. How many here like sweet tea? How many like cookies, baked goods? What's one of the main ingredients always? Sugar. Well, sugar was the first crop to be mass marketed to consumers in Europe. The French, the Spanish, and the English are going to love sugar. The British, they like their tea and crumpets and all their cookies and stuff like that. Primarily tea is going to drive it, but they're going to like baked goods. The French the same way, and so forth. So people are going to demand sugar. Now, sugar is a tropically grown product. Can it be really grown in Italy, Spain, France, or England? No, it has to be imported. Thus, people don't realize one of the biggest initial cash crops to get people to the Hawaiian Islands was sugarcane. The West Indies is tropical, thus a great place to grow sugar. Plantations in the West Indies took off and thousands of African slaves were imported to work there. I can tell you this, one thing that's not fun about tropical areas, especially the Caribbean, is weather, climate, and wild animals. What's one thing that will be stocking sugar fields? It's hot, it's over 100 degrees. Viruses, disease, thrive in that. What's another thing? What type of wildlife? Poisonous snakes, right? Poisonous snakes thrive in those type of environments. So not only if the environment doesn't kill you from the temperatures and diseases, you might get bit by something. Now, there was a seasoning period as well in the Indians to make sure slaves could adapt to the new climate. So they would import them, kind of put them in, I don't know if it was necessary quarantine. They'd give them a little bit, a couple weeks, and see if they lived. Why? They're seeing if they can acclimate to the weather. I think it was there was a percentage that died. I want to say it was like 30%. 70-30%, like 70 survived, 30% died. That might be too high. But the point is, whatever, after that seasoning period that they were acclimated, that those slaves would be kicked out to the work of the plantations to make sure that they were profitable, right? It's horrible. It's inhuman to think of it in terms like this, but this seasoning period did occur and did happen. Now, slavery in the law. Spanish had given slaves some rights under the law. In the Spanish system, you could gain freedom. In the English system, no, not really. You could theoretically, but very, very much more restricted. The English were more repressive, especially to obtain freedom. If you were a slave, you were almost entirely always a slave. Spanish system, you could achieve freedom. Especially Indians could work their way up, become Christians, gain freedom, get out of their oppression regime, make money, though it would not be a lot, but have a chance for a different life. There is evidence of some free blacks in early Virginia, but also laws against them grew over time. There is some probably truth to being free blacks, but like I said, they're going to be kicked out more and they're not going to be welcomed. And over time, a free black and a slave black are not going to be viewed any different. They're going to all be viewed through the same lens that you're black, you are always a slave of the race of the people that are doing the work. You are subhuman, you are not equal. All right, this almost, we got 2 slides and we'll be done for the day. Origins of American slavery, number 3. The rise of Chesapeake slavery, no law to refer explicitly to slaves till the 1660s, and the attempt to improve the status of white servants, attract new settlers, was also given. Thus, you want to create this division between whites and blacks even more. Probably the third point is one of the worst. A slave child born to slave parents is permanently slave. No chance of freedom. So your parents are slaves, you are a slave by default. The other thing is Christians cannot own other Christians as slavery. Very, very ironic. Especially a lot of these southern plantation owners are going to try to keep them from becoming Christians to justify their means. This later a lot of blacks will become Christians. And then they'll have other ways that they get around this, talking about enslavement in the Old Testament. But initially, they don't want whites as slaves because, well, most whites are Christians. Blacks aren't Christian. They're subhumans, blah, 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 all this. This was an early justification of it. Very, very convoluted. And it's very hard to accept today. That's their mindset. But when people are pushed to extremes, they will do extreme things to justify the ends to the means. Now, Bacon's Rebellion, land and labor in Virginia. There is a rebellion that occurs in this area. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, Governor William Berkeley had run corrupt regime for 30 years. Basically, there was a local governor who was corrupt. Local elites enjoyed the benefit of the tobacco farms. They were basically abusing the system. There was other whites there that weren't making a lot of money. The poor were starting to look like those in England. Lots of them. There's lots of poor in the Virginia area. Freed slaves and lower-class farmers despised this and losing precious land. They hated the tolerance of Indian land and not fighting them. So basically, this governor had worked out a status quo deal with the Indians, almost quid pro quo to some degree. People didn't like it, and people were fed up that they were stuck in their crappy lives. Nathaniel Bacon, an ambitious planter, waged a rebellion against the Indians and Bacon. But he basically revolts. We are tired of this stupid, corrupt governor for this period. Though Bacon died and the rebellion was put down, it shifted the concept of labor towards using African slaves and giving lower whites more freedom and more aggression towards Indians. So though Nathaniel Bacon does not see the fruits of his labor rewarded, he revolts, leads others with him, and they realize, you know what? Instead of giving these poor whites and indentured servants crappy lives, let's give them some rights, give them some land, put them to work, and let's bring slaves in so they're not going to revolt. So Nathaniel Bacon's, or the Bacon Rebellion, really speeds up this movement to slavery. Why? Well, slaves don't speak English as well. They're not as educated in this case at this point. I'm not trying to talk down on them. They haven't had the schooling. They're less apt to revolt. Thus it's cheaper. Thus the transition to slave labor, African portions, will increase. Make sense? So Nathaniel Bacon's has a twofold effect. Whites get more privilege. They get rid of the repressive regime there. Whites will gain freedom, but at the cost of African slaves now becoming the primary workforce. And origins of American slavery, number 4. Last slide for today. We've got through quite a bit today. A slave society. Bacon's rebellion was a huge factor. Like I said, that put that death rate began to fall. It became more economical to buy a slave. Slaves were far cheaper as they get seasoned and they can bring more over here, and as basically people got acclimated and it was better infrastructure, they could bring slaves in at a much, much cheaper price. Royal African companies' monopoly of slave trade will end, and thus other companies can start. You could make money from the slave trade, just like trading cattle. The House of Burgesses in 1705 enacted a new slave code. Slaves were property. And this is a mindset that will become very much embedded all the way up to the American Civil War. Slaves are property. They are livestock. They do not have rights. In American history, the famous court case, Dred Scott, the Dred Scott decision we learned about last year, actually the last 2 years of my American history government classes. He was viewed as a slave, thus he could not sue for freedom because he was property. He wasn't a human. Whites and blacks henceforth were tried in different courts. They will not be in the same legal system. And runaway slaves also started to happen at this point, trying to flee. And this is where you're going to get the whole perception of tracking down slaves and bringing them back. Okay, this concludes The first notes, we've got through 3 big bullet points. As a recap, we've talked about mercantilism, the expansion in England's empire. We've talked about the perception of the Indians and how they were treated there and how they kept getting pushed further west, and the origins of American slavery in the colonies and how it was expanded due to several factors. Okay, so this concludes today's lecture.